Graduate Student Committee webinar series titled Beyond the Ivory Tower, Bringing Activist Conversations to Academic Spaces. Our sixth and last discussion is on Beyond Cultural Betrayal, the role of secondary marginalization in violence against Black women. I am Ebony Gabriel, the Communication Chair of SPICY Graduate Student Committee, and I will be facilitating our webinar today. Any opinions or conclusions expressed in this webinar are those of the individual contributors and do not reflect the views of the Society for Psychological Study of Social Issues, the American Psychological Association, or any of their divisions or subunits. Now, let's find out who our panelist is. Dr. Jennifer Gomez earned her PhD in 2017 in clinical psychology and is an assistant professor at the School of Social Work and faculty affiliate at the Center for Innovation in Social Work and Health at Boston University. Additionally, she serves on the boards of Center for Institutional Courage and End Rape on Campus and the Advisory Committee of the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Action Collaborative on Preventing Sexual Harassment in Higher Education. At ISSTD, she serves on the board, scientific committee, and annual conference committee, is a member of the Research SIG, and is a guest co-editor of the upcoming special issue of Journal of Trauma and Dissociation on intersectional oppression, disassociation, and healing in diverse, marginalized people. Dr. Gomez's research centers around cultural betrayal trauma theory, CBTT, which she created as a Black feminist theoretical framework for examining the impact of violence within the context of inequality on Black and other marginalized populations. Her research has been published in over 100 peer-reviewed journals, books, newsletters, regional and national media outlets, and the Open Science Framework. Her work has been funded by the Ford Foundation Fellowships Program administered by NASIM, the Michigan Center for Urban African American Aging Research, National Institute on Aging, and the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Her transdisciplinary book, The Cultural Betrayal of Black Women and Girls, A Black Feminist Approach to Healing from Sexual Abuse, published by the APA, won the 2024 ISSTD Frank W. Putnam Outstanding Book Award. In The Cultural Betrayal of Black Women and Girls, Dr. Gomez centers Black women and girls through incorporating basic research on racism, intersectional oppression, and cultural betrayal trauma theory, as well as application in the form of culturally competent trauma therapy, radical healing in the Black community, institutional courage, and dreamstorming to promote systems levels change. If you would like to find out more about her work, you can go to her website, which is jmgomez.org. And she can also be reached on Blue Sky at Jennifer M. Gomez PhD.bsky.social. And now I will pass it along to Dr. Gomez.
Thank you so much, Ebony, for the gorgeous introduction. It's always really uncomfortable for me to be introduced, so I really appreciate it. And huge thanks to Ebony again for organizing. This has been in the works for months and months that she invited me. I'm really happy to be here. I'll go ahead and share my screen and see if we can't get into slideshow mode. And so since Ebony has been working on this such a long time, the bio was old. I'm actually now an associate professor with tenure. So when you said assistant professor, it gave me a shot of anxiety. It's much better on this side. So happy to be here with everyone. As Ebony mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist by education and currently in social work. Be talking about Beyond Cultural Betrayal, the role of secondary marginalization and violence against Black women and girls. So first, a reminder that this revolution will be televised. Mostly a reminder to myself. So I'm conscious of what I say, and this will be up on YouTube at some point. So if you enjoyed and want to revisit, or if you think someone else might, then look out for it. I'm on YouTube. I want to ground us in the beginning with intersectionality with this quote from Patricia Hill Collins, one of the founding mothers of intersectionality studies, in her new book, Lethal Intersections. It describes how multiple systems of power converge to catalyze expressions of violence that fall more heavily on particular groups. For example, Black people, Indigenous people, women, the young, poor people, immigrants, and LGBTQ people. Intersectionality relies on shorthand terms to examine how such systems are connected. For example, shorthand terms of race and gender or class and nation. These systems each rely on violence in some fashion. Now, the plan I have for us today is to talk about cultural betrayal trauma theory, specifically in the context of sexual violence against Black women and girls. I'm going to go into kind of to secondary marginalization to make sense of some things that we have found in the cultural betrayal research. So going beyond the kind of shared Blackness and general and groupness, cultural betrayal. We're then going to go back to where it all began and kind of explain this all through intersectionality. And then heaven help us all, we're going to highlight some healing of given everything that I'll be talking about, kind of where do we go from here. So to begin, talk about cultural betrayal trauma theory, much what I'll be discussing is also detailed in the cultural betrayal of Black women and girls. I first proposed betrayal trauma theory back in 2012, which was quite a different time. This was still during the Obama administration. But first, there's nothing new under the sun. So academics like to make up a bunch of terms for things, and I've certainly done that with cultural betrayal trauma theory. But really important here, this work is building upon foundational scholarship and activism of Black feminists like the Convoy River Collective, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, of course, Tama Bryant, third world feminists like Gloria Anzaldúa, legal scholar Kim Crenshaw, social worker Tricia Bent Goodley, a Black philosopher Charles Mills, and then also mainstream feminist work like that of Jennifer Fried and Judy Herman. So even though I'll be saying kind of newer concepts with cultural betrayal, nothing new under the sun here, and building on the work of many, many others. So I want to give us a little bit of an explanation of trauma theory and kind of how we got to cultural betrayal trauma. So at the top, what you'll see is a traditional model of trauma. So this is the idea that trauma, like exposure to a hurricane, car accident, incest, is harmful because it scares you. It's called the fear paradigm. It frightens you. And then the idea is that some people, most people will be okay. We have built-in defenses. Some people will develop so-called pathology, and then those people could get treatment. So this is the theoretical frame for your evidence-based treatments of PTSD, things like prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, even trauma-focused CBT, operating under this model. Jennifer Fried introduced betrayal trauma theory back in the early 90s and said, well, wait a second, there's something different between exposure to a hurricane and a father sexually abusing his daughter. And one of those differences is that the second one is happening in the context of a relationship. So pulling here directly from attachment theory that children need their parents, need their caregivers for logistical stuff like food and shelter, and also really importantly for socio-emotional resources, right? To be loved, to be in a relationship, to be connected. And so then when abuse happens here, so when father sexually abuses daughter, then it violates this dependence and perhaps this trust. And so people are vulnerable to that, right, as social creatures. And so that's the part of the harm then is this betrayal, what we call then high betrayal in betrayal trauma theory. Now, if you go down to C, the trauma this time is societal trauma, so something like anti-Black racism. And then the idea coming into cultural betrayal trauma theory is that intracultural trust or solidarity in the Black community then buffers against that mean red arrow of societal trauma and racism. We have each other here, and it's somewhat of a protective factor. Now, the problem arises here down in D that when violence happens in the Black community, as happens in all communities I'm aware of, when violence happens here, then it violates that intercultural trust, violates that solidarity, and we're vulnerable. And so then this cultural betrayal trauma, this within group violence, is associated with various forms of harm. So, put another way, I'll kind of walk you through then just cultural betrayal trauma exclusively here. So, you have at the top that societal trauma, that anti-Black racism, that 1 in 3 Black men are imprisoned in their lifetime, for instance, that's structural racism. You have then some Black people who develop this intercultural trust with each other that's largely positive. And then when violence happens here, it's a cultural betrayal. And so then Black male perpetrated sexual violence against Black women and girls, for instance, is a cultural betrayal trauma. And then those cultural betrayal traumas that within group violence is linked with abuse outcomes. So these are things like mental health, physical health, behavioral health, that kind of stuff, as well as cultural outcomes, things like internalized prejudice. Like if this violence is part of what it means to be Black, then cool, I don't want to be Black anymore. Like a pretty big cost. Now, if we're thinking over here that intercultural trust is positive, at least largely, then you can think of intercultural pressure as this like negative transformation. And here it is the key problems in-house for the good of the group. And so an example of this happened about 10 years ago, where a convocation speaker at an HBCU, a Black man, spoke to the Black female student body and told them during convocation, don't go to the police because you don't like what happened last night. Stop putting our men in prison. And so here, what you're seeing, this intercultural pressure is a call not on Black men to not sexually abuse anyone. No, 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 no. But a call for Black women that when that abuse does happen, don't say anything and don't go to the racist police because then you will be responsible for this instantiation of this feeding into mass incarceration. Yes? Intercultural pressure. Awful, awful. So cultural betrayal trauma then, just to narrow this in, is simply any kind of abuse where the victim and perpetrator or perpetrators share marginalization. Today we're talking about Black folks. Now, some of us might remember in 91, Anita Hill being sworn in to testify about to be confirmed Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas's, what we would now call cultural betrayal, sexual harassment against her. And so we've looked at cultural betrayal trauma across young adult populations that are marginalized and found that even when you control for between group trauma, so when you control for essentially the impact of the trauma itself, even when you control for the perpetrator or perpetrators being somebody close, this cultural betrayal part in trauma is associated with this mental health outcomes and cultural outcomes. And so we've done a lot of work here. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I will highlight that this link between within group violence, we would call cultural betrayal, and outcomes exists for folks who are marginalized. When you look at this within group violence piece in folks who aren't marginalized, like white folks, you don't see the same link, which would make sense, right? This isn't just an in-group thing. It is also it's a marginalized in-group thing. You remove the marginalization, then you remove the cultural betrayal. Now, I want to bring back in Patricia Hill Collins here, this from her landmark book, Black Feminist Thought. She talks about our responsibilities as being outsiders within. So for somebody like myself, who's a Black woman, part of the Black community, part of a white supremacist academic system, and I'm an outsider within then that system. And she talks about our responsibilities as outsiders within. And the first is that our work needs to have connection with and approval by ordinary people. So what we did here then to address that call as part of intersectionality praxis, myself and my colleague Robin Gobin, is we did a quantitative study, pretty standard cultural betrayal trauma quant study. And at the end of it, we just said, hey, thanks so much for taking the survey. This is cultural betrayal trauma theory. I'm wondering what you think about cultural betrayal potentially being harmful to folks. So not deep, really open-ended, and just attempting to get at this like for ordinary people, right? For people who aren't in academia, does cultural betrayal trauma theory make sense? And so here's what some folks said. So that cultural betrayal was more prominent for those Black people who, quote, don't fit the status quo. This goes for Black, typically dark-skinned women, transgender women, lesbian, gay, or bisexual Black people, those who aren't religious. Another Black woman said, it felt like my pain was disregarded because it didn't fit the most convenient narrative. And so taking it together, what we have this intercultural piece that I told you about of this convocation speaker saying Black women don't don't report, don't go to the police. And then you also have Black women who've experienced cultural betrayal, sexual trauma saying, yeah, there was something else happening, right? There was something, another kind of oppression or discrimination happening. So how do we make sense of this? I want to pull in secondary marginalization. So secondary marginalization comes from Kathy Cohen over in political science. I wrote The Cultural Betrayal of Black Women and Girls when I was on fellowship at CASB, which is the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And what they do is that they bring people from across fields, across disciplines, into Stanford for a year, into CASB, and we interface with each other. And they're the way they recruit, there are like subgroups of scholars. So the year I was there, there was a subgroup of democracy scholars and a subgroup of race scholars. So what you do in the subgroups is you get together and you form kind of journal clubs, and then you bring in like, hey, from my field, check this out. See, let's discuss and see what we all think. So a fellow who's a political scientist brought in Kathy Cohen's work. And my mind was blown. So she says, secondary processes of marginalization can be exercised by the more privileged members of marginal groups as the management of marginal group members is negotiated daily by those they would call their own. And so for me, I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. What I've been trying to understand with the concept of intercultural pressure and with cultural betrayal that nothing else would explain. Because if we're going to protect the Black community, you can imagine that if you perpetrate rape, for instance, that you would be ostracized, that you would say, that's not behavior that is acceptable for us. You're going to make us all look bad. And so we're not going to align with you. And I said, well, is it just normal, like normal, typical victim blaming? The black sheep effect in social psych would certainly say that the people who are perpetrating negative behavior would be the ones who are ostracized, but it is not what we're seeing. Instead, we're seeing death threats against Black women who are speaking out about R. Kelly victimizing them. How do we explain this? I think this secondary marginalization really helps us. So let's see secondary marginalization in action. So here I'm going to highlight Russell Simmons, who's a Uncle Russ, major figure in African American community, extremely successful, extremely influential in the culture. He went on a talk show or a radio show a few years ago and said, I want my daughters to have proper boundaries because toxic femininity is when one perhaps may not put up those boundaries and may regret it later. So I want my daughters to know how to say no, and I want my daughters to put up boundaries and be strong and be leaders. This is in the context of Russell Simmons having about 20 women disclosing that he perpetrated sexual violence against them. I'll point you to the brilliant documentary On the Record featuring hip hop legends Drew Dixon, Sherry Cher, Mercedes Ladies, and many others discussing Russell Simmons' sexual violence against them. I'll also point you to YouTube. We have a panel on the record, a conversation on cultural betrayal trauma theory, where we talk about this. Uh, in the context of CBTT, myself, Sherry Cher, the Mercedes Ladies, Joan Morgan, former journalist at Vibe magazine, and others. Now, what I wrote about this in the cultural betrayal of Black women and girls, I said that Simmons engages in secondary marginalization against Black women and girls by dictating how we should behave while conveniently alighting his own allegedly sexually abusive behavior. Pretty bold, what he said. Had a lot of nerve to say what he said. The result is further oppression and exclusion of Black women and girls' needs that is cloaked within a race rape culture in which Black women and girls are erroneously made responsible for the abusive behaviors of some Black men. Now, the some part of this is really important because CBTT exists in the world in which Black men and boys are stereotyped to be hypersexual, hyperviolent, rapists. But we know there is nothing about Blackness or maleness or Black maleness put together that is synonymous with sexually abusive behavior. And we know that there are plenty of Black men who don't engage in that behavior and who aren't okay with it. So Robin Gobin, same Robin Gobin of the Intersectionality Praxis article, joined me in writing this piece for Blavity, where we talk about this false notion of toxic femininity brought by Russell Simmons, and what Black men can do to be part of the solution. I'm here. So I brought you through a little bit of trauma theory and where cultural betrayal trauma theory is situated. We talked about cultural betrayal trauma theory, then we've talked about secondary marginalization, and I want to take us back home into intersectionality. So intersectionality, not about identities. Say it loud, say it proud, say it one more time for people in the back. Intersectionality, not about identities, and not about multiple identities. If you are interested in how multiple identities impact folks, then I point you to the brilliant work of Michael Haynes Garcia, including in his book Identity Complex, Making the Case for Multiplicity. Here, Michael Haynes Garcia talks about how different identities kind of co-create and create meaning for each other. So specifically, an example he talks about is what it means to be Latino is informed by what it means to be gay. And what it means to be gay is what it is informed by what it means to be Latino. Doesn't really make sense to think about Latino identity over here and gay identity over here because they're coming together and making meaning and kind of like this amalgamated, sort of identity. So that's multiplicity. Really important, just not intersectionality. So intersectionality is intersecting or interlocking oppressions, and this comes from approximately 150 years or so of very public documented work by Black feminist activists and scholars, and could very well have been discussed before this time as well, and just wasn't documented or public in the same way. I'll point us to Anna Julia Cooper from 1892. She says that the colored woman of today occupies a unique position in this country. She is confronted by both a woman question and a race problem, and is as yet an unknown or unacknowledged factor in both. And so what we have then, interlocking oppressions, intersecting oppressions, and then you have Kim Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality. So by far not the first to be discussing these interlocking oppressions, but was the one to coin the term intersectionality. And in her landmark Mapping the Margins article from 91, she talks about three different kinds of intersectionality. So structural intersectionality, this racism, sexism, nationalism, homophobia, etc., interlocks together to oppress folks. She talks about representational intersectionality, that the images of women of color are distorted in media, misrepresented. What I want us to hone in on is political intersectionality. So here it's that sexual violence against women and girls of color, in this case, Black women, are not prioritized in white feminist movements or in anti-racism initiatives. So remember, with the Black Lives Matter movement, that Black men and boys and the plight against them, the discrimination against them, the violence against them was privileged. Over here in the Me Too movement, we see that it's rich white women who are being centered. Um, and part of what you have happening is that there is a sexism issue happening in civil rights or anti-racist movements. There's a racism issue happening in white feminist movements. And it's in the context that both of these movements, Black Lives Matter and Me Too, were founded by Black women. And so this is not at all a critique of these Black women. This is about the uptake, the societal uptake of Black Lives Matter and Me Too. I'll also say I serve on the board of EROC, which is End Rape on Campus, which is headed by wonderful social worker Kenyora Johnson. I serve on the board alongside Tarana Burke, who is brilliant. And if you've never been able to share a space with her, I feel sorry for the for the awful life you must have led. She is phenomenal. And again, not a critique on her or the founders of Black Lives Matter, but on the societal uptake. And that societal uptake is this political intersectionality. Now, in her memoir, Unbound, which I believe is behind me here, she says, let me find it here, she says that after the Me Too hashtag went viral, it became clear to me that many Black women were not engaging in the same public celebration of feeling freed from their voices, from their stories, as white women. As white women were, many Black women couldn't take that same leap. And that's that political intersectionality, that's that erasure that Anna Julia Cooper in 1892 was telling us about. Now, so what is the relation to violence here? So intersectionality needs violence, right? Um, Violence enforces intersectional oppression. And so if you're thinking about that secondary marginalization that we were talking about, that certain people, so Black women and girls should be lower status. And you can have someone like Russell Simmons who is saying and managing verbally. You can also think about the sexual violence that then reifies that lower status. So violence enforces intersectional oppression, including secondary marginalization. But violence also needs intersectionality. So we can ask, in what world and how is it okay to rape people? It is unacceptable. So how is it okay to rape certain people? Well, intersectional oppression, lower status, secondary marginalization justifies the violence that then happens, in this case, to Black women and girls. So you have this bidirectional need-field relationship between intersectionality or intersectional oppression and violence. So heaven help us. Where's the healing and what do we do with all that information? So we have Black women and girls. What you hear often from folks is give them therapy. And then you have some Debbie Downer who comes in and says, well, wait a second, there's racism and intersectional oppression and secondary marginalization and sexual trauma, but also cultural betrayal in that. There's intercultural pressure, there's that violent silencing of you say nothing to anyone, and people's responses is culturally competent, trauma therapy. That's the ticket. So what I say is like, no, so it's not enough. I'm not anti-individual healing. I just happen to think there's a lot more going on. So there needs to be interpersonal healing, community level healing. There needs to be structural healing, kind of how Tama Bryant talks to us about how justice is healing and how we need to actually change the structures of discrimination, change our systems. And so in the cultural portrayal of Black women and girls, what you'll have is the first half that says everything's terrible and here are all the ways. And the second half says, okay, what do we do with that? How about inside the therapy room? culturally competent trauma therapy, from relational cultural therapy, the feminist framework, as well as the liberation health framework is also featured from social work. Radical healing in the Black community, featuring the psychological framework for radical healing in communities of color, and other forms of radical healing at the individual, community, family level. And then institutional courage to change the world. Institutional courage comes from Jennifer Fried, the same Jennifer Fried who brought us betrayal trauma theory, saying, how do we actually change the systems? So there's no discrimination and no violence. Uh, and then we had this concept of dreamstorming. So dreamstorming is a concept of mind more than simple brainstorming or daydreaming. Dreamstorming is the process of envisioning liberation, as well as the paths it would take to create and inhabit a world of true freedom. And so here you're thinking, okay, if the world were perfectly equal and perfectly peaceful, what would that be like? No violence, no discrimination, no intersexual oppression, no rape, no nothing. What would that be like? And what would have to be here if that's how it was? What would need to not be here? What would need to be abolished? And then you reverse engineer in our efforts, in our change making efforts. How do we get to that dream-stormed world? Um, for me, a couple things come up of I take walks often, and I wear what I call my movie star shades. They're my big dark black glasses. Those are my don't sexually harass me shades. And if you do sexually harass me, I have a buffer in my shades. I've begun not wearing them because it's humid where I live, and I want to be more free. Doesn't actually take away the sexual harassment though, um, because sexual harassment actually isn't in my own control. So me imagining what would it be like if I knew I could walk outside and not be sexually harassed? What would it be like if our prevention efforts were not, ladies, when you go out, don't wear a short skirt, put your hand over your drink, go in pairs to the bathroom. Um, don't sleep with a person, then you're a slut, and they rape sluts, so don't do that. Don't not sleep with someone, then you're a tease, so don't do that. Somehow figure that one out. But we promise when you are, we'll tell you it wasn't your fault. But in the meantime, we'll do whatever we can to restrict your freedoms in order to not be raped. Dream story could be something different. We could say, you can't rape anyone at any time, actually. And if we did our efforts that way, what would that look like? Lastly, I want to say that I'll open up um, and questions and your thoughts. Um, of what do we do? We have institutional courage, we have dream storming. I want to highlight pulling strength, wisdom, and perseverance from our ancestors, this from the Lion King, this image of looking up at the stars and our ancestors lived there. I'll pull you to Maisha Baliso de Jesus, who's also a Casby Fellow with me at Stanford, wrote our books at the same time. In her book, Excited Delirium, which is phenomenal. But during the Casby year, she talked about the racial laboratory and how some of us are fortunate enough to be able to speak and be in dialogue with our ancestors. And for those of us who are able, let's go ahead and do that and remain in dialogue with our ancestors and not allow capital S scientists tell us that something like the racial lab doesn't exist, or that we can't actually speak with our ancestors. Or there are those of us who know that we can and that we pull wisdom directly. I'll point you to Cito, his book by Lawrence Ralph, also a Casby Fellow with me at Stanford, writing the book at the same time. Both Aisha and Lawrence are anthropologists. In his book Cito, he talks about the family pulling wisdom on how to heal after Cito's murder and pulling wisdom from Cito himself of what he would believe justice to be, and that it would not be carcerality or the carceral state. So we're able, in thinking about how do we change the world, what do we do next, being able to pull from the wisdom of our ancestors. We are not actually in unprecedented times. The times are very precedented, right? And our ancestors can teach us that. Proof, that's all I have for us before opening it up. And last thing I'll say, absolutely adore Spissy. So I'm really happy to be able to be here with you all and happy to be in discussion. Thanks so much.
Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Gomez, for that wonderful presentation. Okay, so one question that we have is, let's see, what inspired you to develop cultural betrayal trauma theory, and how did your journey as a scholar shape this? In what ways does CBTT reveal the interplay between personal betrayal and collective cultural harm?
Ooh, yeah. So for me, the inspiration came from I was a dancer with the Dance Theater of Harlem before going to college, and I was quite aware of the bond that we had as Black dancers at DTH, or Dance Theater of Harlem, as well as aware that when I took dance classes at Steps, which is a kind of an open dance studio that lots of professionals, non-professional dancers take classes in. Ballet is very hierarchical. And so if you're in different companies or not professional, like you don't talk. If you're different ranks, you don't talk to each other typically. And yet all the Black dancers were friendly, at least with each other. And so it's that piece of just like the early theorizing of we're presuming, correctly or incorrectly, that we have something in common and have a cause for solidarity because we're in this very white ballet world where there is discrimination. So I think that experience combined with Jennifer Fried's betrayal trauma theory and thinking about, I wonder if there's this kind of vulnerability and connection and attachment that happens within families. I wonder if there's something similar that happens within the Black community with Black people. And if there is something similar, then if a betrayal, what I came to call a cultural betrayal, if that would be part of it, if that would be part of the harm. So really coming from my personal life experience around this, and then the work of betrayal trauma theory. Um, for me, my journey as a scholar, so my grad advisor was Jennifer Fried. Don't know, is a world-renowned trauma researcher, transformed the field, trauma psychology with her work with betrayal trauma theory. And she always was incredibly supportive of me in doing this work. Um, but it took 5 years for anything peer reviewed to be published because it was rejected, 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 everywhere rejected. No one would take it. No one would take a theory paper. No one would take an empirical study. No one would take anything. Um, that's mainstream psychology journals. That's feminist journals. That's race journals. Nobody was taking it. And so during that time, I was a graduate student. And I always believed in cultural betrayal trauma theory. I thought it was important, and I believed that it would give an avenue for research. So it wasn't about proving the tenets of cultural betrayal trauma theory, but it was about how can this theory help us to ask different questions that gets closer to the complexity of what's happening with violence and with trauma sequela. So I always believed in that. I just felt bad for CBTT that it had me as a creator for a long time. I thought maybe I'm just too stupid to do this. Maybe it just needs somebody smarter because no matter what I do, it's not being accepted in any spaces. And so for me, in terms of the scholarly journal, and through my mentorship from Jennifer Fried, I got it out wherever I could. And so I had a publication in the Division 56 newsletter in 2015, Division 35 newsletter in 2015. Just by hook or by crook, started talking about it. I became a Ford Fellow also in 2015. That was a good year, and that gave legitimacy. Um, and then over time, Black Lives Matter and Me Too happened. And then the importance of this work and more of the acceptance of this work, it changed pretty quickly, pretty dramatically. Um, I think so. In what ways does CBTT reveal the interplay between personal and collective? I think it sits in both, and from social work, like the micro and the macro level, like you go in between the two, the individual and the societal level, individual and community level. And so I think CBTT does that insofar that it works in conjunction with betrayal trauma theory. So also incorporates high betrayal, like that interpersonal betrayal part, as well as the interpersonalness, community-ness of cultural betrayal and in-group dynamics, like with intercultural pressure, also intercultural support, as other Black people being supportive in the complexity of what this is and the complexity of inequality. And then, of course, with CBTT, the thing that's implicated is the societal inequality is that are the bigoted systems. Without the bigotry of the systemic discrimination, there is no cultural betrayal. It just doesn't exist. And so I think in the single framework of CBTT, at least I hope what a goal is to be incorporating all these different layers inside of it. So we're able to be thinking about those different layers as we understand victimization. Oh, are you coming back to me, Ebony?
Yes. Thank you so much for that response. I have a few questions here in the chat. Okay, so we have one from Christina. She said, I'm teaching a doctoral class in social justice and psychology, and this week just so happens to be on social justice and IPV. Thank you so much. I CNA bring in students struggle with feeling there is not much outside the therapy room they can do to advocate for clients. Any suggestions for those up and coming in the field?
Sorry. So the concern is that there's not much outs like there's stuff happening outside the therapy room, but like you can't do anything about that or
Yeah, I believe that her question is, she said that some students are feeling that, yeah, there's not much, I guess, maybe interventions happening outside the therapy room that they can advocate for their clients. So she's wondering, do you have any suggestions for those that are up and coming, in the fields of like social justice and IPV?
Momento. So there are things like Association of Black Psychologists has emotional emancipation circles, and the Community Healing Network, in collaboration with ABSI for these EECs, these emotional emancipation circles, where you have folks come together when there's been a big racial harm or racial violence, like police have murdered yet another Black person, and come into the community to say, like, let's come together, let's reclaim our our strength, let's mourn, let's connect. I've been wondering for quite some time about what could we do emotional emancipation circle inspired kind of spaces for cultural betrayal, sexual violence, IPV, of like, is there a way, to the extent that intercultural trust is both protective as well as give us vulnerability, how can we use intercultural trust to come together in community? Um, so I would say that's one thing to be thinking about. Another thing is there are actually lots of nonprofit organizations doing phenomenal community work. So here in the Boston area is We Are Better Together, does great work around people who have experienced violence and people who do the violence. Has a lot of different groups, and Rape on Campus is another one, as already mentioned, with a framework of centering the margins, working to address campus sexual violence, which of course includes IPV. They're Set the Expectation, also based around sexual violence prevention, then IPV is implicated in that. So I think there are uh, a lot of community orgs doing phenomenal work and being able to there's CISA, sorry to interrupt myself, Sisters of Color Ending Sexual Assault, CISA, a national organization that serves as, among other things, a hub for different organizations of color across the US doing work to end sexual violence. Again, IPV is implicated here. So I think being able to get connected with community orgs that are doing the work, and being able to bring the expertise that we have as researchers, as clinicians, to work alongside community orgs in whatever way is or would be beneficial, and being able to point our clients to those spaces locally and nationally, I think is helpful. I think my initial frown to the question was like, oh my gosh, as a clinician, there's so much advocacy to be done, right? Because so much crap is done to our clients. And so I teach MSW students, Master of Social Work students here in clinical courses, and there's always macro level components, institutional change components, because that's part of being a clinician. So even to the point of stuff like release of information, to be able to talk to psychiatrists who maybe is medicating a client at a very high rate that seems contraindicated from your perspective, being able to advocate on their behalf. I've done things where I worked in a clinic that had a lot of bigotry problems, and I had a client who was a Black woman, experienced a lot of cultural betrayal, trauma of all kinds, and there was an upcoming DBT group, and DBT has a lot of writing in it, as a lot of evidence-based treatments tend to do. And my client was functionally illiterate. Um, and so I didn't just send her to the group and say, "Okay, good luck." I went and talked with the clinicians and I said, "Here's the situation. Is this going to be beneficial for my client?" And when I got bigotry back, I said, cool, okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go consult with not you, but another DBT therapist and see what I can bring in that would be beneficial for this client, since I'm not going to send her to this group where there's bigotry. So I think there's the advocacy piece at a kind of at each case, like in this particular situation, you're advocating, or to like can't we abolish child welfare system already? Like level. I'm pulling from, I don't know if you can see his book up here, Alan Detlef's book on abolishing child welfare given the massive rates of racism and classism, and its links with slavery and psychological warfare, removing children from parents during the slavery era. So there are efforts to be made at it kind of like case by case basis, as well as like larger, like could we like do this way different, so that our clients are in a better position. Because when IPV is happening in the home and children are there and it's male perpetrated against a woman, oftentimes the woman is blamed for that in ways that aren't fair or helpful and that are intersectionally oppressive, right? So I think lots of ways on a case by case, as well as more systemic change.
Thank you. So we have another question. Thank you, Dr. Gomez, for this insightful lecture. Do you think CBTT could have applications for other marginalized communities, or would it be inappropriate to extract it from its specific context of violence within Black communities?
Oh, it's a great question. And it's one I get quite often, actually. And so I think that I don't think there's how do I want to say this? White supremacy has touched so many groups domestically and abroad. And there's a white supremacy frame, like a critical race framing, right? Within CBTT. So to the extent that it makes sense, and white et al. Supremacy, right? The extent that it makes sense to use with another group is fine, just so long as it's understood that it's coming from this particular framework, particularly Black feminist, critical race, US based. And then there may need to be adaptations around how does white et al. Supremacy show up in this particular group. So I'll point you to Zenaida Rivera, who's newly Dr. Zenaida Rivera. Her dissertation out of Wayne State was testing cultural betrayal trauma theory among white gay men, with the gay part being the in group, as just one example. I'll also say about 10 years ago, I went to South Africa and I was able to get into the University of Johannesburg and talked with the psych department there about cultural betrayal trauma theory, and essentially just saying like I don't want to be that American, you know what I'm saying? Who goes to the country and says what we're doing here, maps onto what's happening in an entirely different context. I don't want to be that American. So I just went, I said, like, here's what I'm thinking, like, does or does not, and if so, how this map onto the South African context. And it was such a rich discussion. And it was sort of what I was describing of like the general framework did, and what it looked like, what outcomes you'd be looking for, who's the in group, right? A lot of like what an American would say is Black is different in South Africa, so many different cultures. Um, and so like how it manifests is different, but the general tenets were similar. And that was on the one hand really bonding and like solidarity and connection. On the other hand, like super sad, right? To be like across an ocean, across space and time, like this white supremacy is a doozy um, across countries.
Hey, thank you. We have another question from Maria. Congratulations on becoming tenured. First encountered your work in your presumed incompetent book chapter in grad school. My question is, can you point to any literature or work where cultural betrayal trauma is studied and discussed in the context of religion or churches, more specifically immigrant or diaspora ethno-religious groups?
Oh, so, so thank you. The Presumed Incompetent book. So there are two volumes. I have them over here, so I can't show you. But there are two volumes of books that I would highly recommend. Presumed Incompetent 1, Presumed Incompetent 2, about the experience of diverse women of color in the academy. Phenomenal volumes. So. Uh, I'm not aware of any work around cultural betrayal in the religious communities that you described. What is currently under progress is work by Logan Zelenak and myself, with Logan as a very clear lead on religious betrayal trauma theory. And so there we're looking at specifically the context of the Catholic Church and priest perpetrated sexual abuse as a religious betrayal. Um, and in that context, we kind of have the framework of this religious betrayal, so the priest perpetrated sexual abuse, religious betrayal trauma, as well as the high betrayal within that the priest maybe is even additionally interpersonally trusted. A cultural betrayal, potentially within that when you have an ethnic parish. And institutional betrayal, which comes from Carly Smith and Jennifer Fried around the institution of the Catholic Church. So there's some work that give us a second, that we're working on around religious betrayal in the Catholic context in particular, but not in the other religious community contexts, which means that it's rife to be done and to be examined. And I will say, majority, if not all, of the published empirical work on culture betrayal includes me. Um, and and when people want to do cultural betrayal work, they tend to come to me and say, like, will you collaborate? And I understand why that is, but there is so much value, I think, in not having me be involved because I'm one person with one lens. And so the ability to have other minds, other perspectives, other emotions take this work independently of me could be really positive. Whereas I might de facto limit it um, by virtue of being a solo person. So part of the hope is to have more people uptake this work in ways that make sense and in ways that are culturally congruent and competent, right? And not just an import.
Absolutely. All right, we have another question. This is from Bernice. Hi, Dr. Gomez. Thank you so much for your work and wisdom. I'm doing research on the acting white accusation among multiracial populations. I'm wondering what you think about CBTT and how it may apply among multiracial people of color compared to most multiracial people who are white.
Ooh. So I'm wondering if you're doing work with Miles Durkee, that person out of Michigan. If so, tell Miles I say what's up. So first, Miles Durkee and I have a paper. I want to say it's Durkee and Gomez, from a few years ago that looks at the acting white accusation as a cultural betrayal, and looks at outcomes there. Those are with the presumption of being monoracial. Um, the the question of folks of color who are multiracial. So my very first graduate student, Deja Marcet, was taking this on in terms of the kind of being in the liminal space as a biracial and multiracial person, and kind of like the who is your in group, and potential for kind of predisposed rejection within an in group via the acting white accusation or many others. And then what happens when violence happens. We unfortunately, she didn't have a great relationship, but where I was working, we weren't able to retain her. And so she's off in the world doing amazing, wonderful things. And so this is the question is has not, sorry, my brain is short circuiting. The question, as I mourn the work that could have happened with Deja Marcet, but it's something to be done, to be examined that has not, again, to my knowledge, but very complicates how we think of, particularly around like who is the in group, what is the role then of intercultural trust? How would you know if cultural betrayal trauma was linked with less identification? It's all open questions.
Okay, so it looks like we have about a few minutes left. It looks like we have three questions left. Okay, so we're going to try to get through those. So the first one we have here is from mm, last name De La Rosa. Okay. Your talk reminded me of the fast-tailored girl trope about young Black girls alongside the strong Black woman stereotype. Both seem to contribute to self-blame and silencing in the context of violence, particularly sexual violence. In clinical settings, how are these intersecting stereotypes acknowledged and addressed? And to what extent are clients themselves aware of the impact of these tropes, given that stereotypes are often internalized and accepted as reality by those they target?
Really good question. So I'll try to be quick. So how are they addressed? Is going to depend on who the clinician is. My guess is mostly not a lot. If we're thinking about how are we educated in clinical psychology and in social work, my guess is not a lot. What I would propose would be to incorporate it and to include psychoeducation. And depending on the client, you might include it with the language, like strong Black women ideology, or you might not use that language, but you would talk about the concept and do some psychoed. The Liberation Health Framework from social work helps a lot with this. There's a Liberation Health Triangle where you have a problem statement in the beginning, like, it's all my fault, I'm to blame. And then you look at the individual factors, the structural factor, institutional factors, the structural factors, and the societal factors. And in that framework, you'd be able to discuss really readily something like the strong Black woman ideology and little Black girls being fast and all that kind of stuff. So there are frameworks out there to put it in very directly, and and certainly in our case centralization, and then within psychoed. to be seeing about how these are showing up for the client.
Okay, thank you. And let's see, we have one question from Brianna. One of the participant quotes mentioned how women and members of the LGBTQ community feel this cultural betrayal. How do you see CBTT being used to explore anti-trans, anti-LGB sentiments within the Black community?
Oh, well, I think it would be incredibly useful, if I do say so myself, in the Black community and also in the LGBT community, like anti-Blackness happening in the LGBT space, and then anti-trans stuff happening in the Black space. And then you're getting, when that's the case, and that's dominant culture certainly is the case in both of these groups, then how you're getting culture portrayal in both spaces, in which case, where do you go? And so I think the cultural portrayal lens with that secondary marginalization framing can help to look at how the cultural betrayal of the prime group, whatever we call that to be, on top of the oppression, the secondary marginalization of transphobia, of racism, of intersectional oppression, etc. Super exciting work.
Okay, and our last question. Hi, Dr. Gomez. I just entered BU for my doctoral studies. I'm reading your book now and appreciate your timely wisdom. I love how you center the experiences of Black women and girls in the book, especially when talking about the white voice. How do you balance centering participant voices and discussing the white race when discussing the complexity of cultural betrayal trauma theory?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you for that and welcome to BU. Um, so just quickly, I would say this was a big effort when I was writing the book. And Aisha Beliso de Jesus, who's a professor of anthropology at Princeton, she's the one with the Excited Delirium book that I mentioned. She worked with me quite a bit on my knee-jerk reaction to center white people as I was writing. And what she talked to me about was my kind of apologizing of like, Black women were just so complicated. We have like the racism stuff and the sexism stuff. And her really pushing me to unapologetically center Black women and girls, including in the language that's used, the in-groupedness, the references, like all of that in centering. And it was an active process. And spending the year doing that has made me see how much the white read lives in my head, given the academic spaces that I'm in, and how it's an action of healing to just be disregarding it and saying, like, I'm not uninviting white people. Y'all are welcome. But you are not the center of my universe, and you are not who I'm thinking about first. And just always going back and back and back to that frame. That who I'm centering is the us, and not an imagined white audience that is bigoted. Because a lot of what I get sometimes too is like, well, you might want to soften the tone because you want people to be able to hear it. And I was like, well, I'm going to trust that white people can hear it. I'm actually not going to believe that white people are just a bunch of ignorant bigots who could never understand anything beyond themselves. I've never been white, but I would be insulted by that framing if I were white. So I'm trusting that white people as fellow human beings are able to think critically, to push themselves, move through defensiveness, just as we all have to do. Um, and so for anyone who wants to do that, you're more than welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gomez, for all of your answers to all the questions in the chat today. We are at time. Thank you so much, everyone. I know we went over it by 5 minutes. Dr. Gomez, do you have any contact information that you want to share with anyone if they have any additional questions that we didn't get to today? I don't know if you have like a slide or something with your contact information on there.
Oh, sure. I have my little voice. I do have a slide. It's going to take me 50 years to get it up. But my website is jmgomez.org. So I'm Jennifer M. Gomez, jmgomez.org. You'll always find my contact info to be able to get in touch with me.
Awesome, awesome. Well, we want to thank you so much for taking your time today to talk to us. And thank you for all of your questions. Thank you for attending this webinar. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day and their week.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you so much, Ebony.
No problem. Thank you. Take care, everyone.